Hi, I'm Cadieux, an animator and illustrator.
And I'm Ira Marcks. I write and draw comics. And this is a podcast about the mysterious and magical process of bringing cartoon stories to life.
You're not wrong, Ira. And in today's episode, we're doing something a little new for the podcast. And we're going to be talking all about the art of rotoscoping. So get ready. Welcome to Cartoon Feeling.
Since the dawn of animation, Caitlin, we're
Yes.
going all the way back.
Go on.
There's been this technique, this process, this craft, this art.
No, that doesn't sound right.
No, it's true. They call it rotoscoping.
Ah.
But what we don't know is why, or who, or where.
And if you're listening to this, don't listen to any of our previous episodes where we kind of talk about some of that.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to clear the slate and do a kind of a nature document, like a Carl Sagan,
It's never been caught on camera.
Yeah. But we're zooming in the world of animation. We're looking at rotoscoping, a thing that's been on our periph and directly in our face at different times.
It has been on our periph. I really like that.
Those are phrases I don't use in real life.
He does.
In case you were wondering, Tommy. We're not to you yet. Hold on one second. So today we have with us, I just love to throw myself out there as giving a title to a person who I really respect, but a title that maybe isn't accurate to them exactly.
Oh my God, what are you about to say?
I could say animation director, but I'm going to say shepherd of rotoscoping.
Wow.
Kind of a director of the medium who's kind of
we can get a live take on this, by the way.
Okay, we got to get there. I'm starting to sweat too much already. With us today is animation director / shepherd of rotoscoping, Tommy Pallotta. Tommy, are you here?
I am. Hi, how are you doing?
How do you feel about the idea of being a shepherd?
I mean, I've been doing it for a long time. I kind of almost feel like a grandfather at this point with it. And I've been doing Rotoscope for about 25 years.
It's true.
Now. But I've always resisted the labels. And I mean, I think of myself as a filmmaker or a storyteller. It's sort of my default. But I enjoy rotoscoping, and it's something that I've done a lot of, and I keep on returning to just because I feel like there's so much potential in it still.
Hell yeah. And for all those reasons and more, we're just, it's like serendipity, like the timing of this. If I don't suspect that you've listened to every second of our show or even any of it. So I'll just kind of paint a little picture. We've covered rotoscoping in a couple different occasions in a couple different ways, because it wasn't always the focus. First time was when we did Lord of the Rings.
Yes, I think, and it was just incidental because we were doing the Hobbit, animated Hobbit, and we did the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And so that just happens to have a lot of rotoscoping, and
we didn't dig into that aspect of it. Really. We're more story focused. Mm-hmm. And now more recently, we've talked specifically about Max Fleischer, who we'll get into a little bit, being kind of the great grandfather, I guess, of it all, right? And that, I think, it kind of brought it into the foreground a little bit more for us.
Yes, because I remember remarking that I just had no idea that it was oh, he invented this technique, and I was whoa. I never thought about where it came from. Because I'd always just sort of been that's a way you can do that. That's something that animation's that's a part of animation, whatever. Never once thought somebody had to be the first one.
Right.
And so that was really cool. I was it's been a long time since I've learned a nerdy animation history fact that I hadn't picked up in some way at some point.
Yeah. Same page. So I think here's what we'd like to do, Tommy. We'd like to kind of talk about what rotoscoping is specifically, because I think for a lot of us, it's kind of one of those design tools that's invisible unless you really think about it. And then going through a little of the history, and then where you come in, we want to start to like follow your story with some of the projects you've brought up to us specifically, because I think you're like this secret figure that maybe not a lot of people know by name, but are like there in so many like important moments with this craft. Does that sound okay?
It sounds way more mysterious and cool than I really am, but I like the secret figure.
Hell yeah.
We're blowing.
Lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, we're going to edit this like an NPR, like deep dive investigative.
How about, so let's maybe start with you a little bit, because like you said, self-described as we would guess, like, you know, storyteller, filmmaker. Where does the idea of rotoscoping and like cartooning, some of these aesthetics fit into like your art life early on?
I was born in rural Texas, and the whole notion of making movies or telling stories wasn't really something that was like a real option growing up. I just didn't really think about it. I, of course, liked movies like everybody else in the world. Like, it's hard for me to imagine somebody who doesn't like movies or storytelling. I love literature. And I just so happened to befriend a guy named Richard Linklater, who went and made a movie called Slacker. And it got sort of national recognition. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, and I was a PA on that. I didn't take film school or anything like that. I studied philosophy. But I knew that there's nothing you can do with a philosophy degree except teach. So when I saw Rick making his movies, I thought, oh, this is great. And it was that period where it was, the Linklater, the Robert Rodriguez, who was another guy from Austin who was at the Access Station, which is where you went when you weren't in film school to get access to video cameras and editing equipment to do all that stuff. And that there was a sort of indie explosion. Kevin Smith, of course, came out with his thing. So I just started making live action movies and things like that. But it really felt like by the time I made my first feature, I directed a feature, it felt like that was kind of over, and I was tired of it. And I met a guy named Bob Sabiston who was doing a sort of a hybrid of 2D and 3D animation at the time. Mm-hmm. He came out of MIT, and we both were kind of at the same, like, we just both finished a big project that took years and years. We were both broke, and we both wanted to do something different. I was interested in animation. He was interested in live action. We got to talking. I had a studio. I said, come into my studio. Let's figure out a way we could work together. And we thought, well, let's just sort of draw over and reinterpret QuickTime files. At the time, and again, this is, I don't remember the exact year, maybe 96, somewhere around mid to late 90s. There just wasn't anything available to do that. We were both surprised. We thought that this is sort of a simple thing. You could do it in Photoshop. Why cannot you do it, on video? Luckily, he's a great programmer, and he just made a very simple program that allowed you to draw over the QuickTime files. And so that's really how it started. It really was a way to kind of find what we liked about both live action and animation, but to create it in a very spontaneous way. Like, what we wanted to do was create animation very quickly. And the other sort of objective was to take sort of content that wasn't inherently dramatic. That was really, we were looking at what can we take that's pretty banal, but that the visuals can raise it into something else that made it extraordinary. So taking the ordinary and making it into the extraordinary. So we really just started interviewing people. And at the time, we were living in New York, and we won a contest in MTV. We started doing interstitials for MTV. And so we had a bunch of equipment, and then we started just interviewing people at parks and just going up to people randomly and saying, like, asking them about their lives and going like, hey, we're going to turn you to a cartoon character. Tell us who you are and what you're doing and what's interesting to you. And that was very joyful for us both. It was very freeing. And it was very quick, and it was fun, and it was new. People hadn't seen much about it. It really, for me, the origins of all this, because I'm not a film scholar or an animation scholar, my first introduction to it was the Aha music video, Take On Me, which came out in the early 80s, which was a Rotoscope music video. And I mean, I kind of like when we first started, that was the way I would explain it to people. I'd be like, you know, the Aha music video, and everybody knew the Aha music video. I was like, it's like that, you know,
cultural
touchstone,
like
live action, but then you transform it into animation.
Totally.
So that was really kind of like, I think that Aha music video was probably the biggest influence on me at that time.
Right. I think you've obviously seen that.
Of course.
Like can you picture like seeing it for the first time and the way it strips away like so many aspects of other things that distract you visually to be like, oh, someone's like redrawing this stuff. So just so we can note a couple of the projects you have kind of gone over specifically in case people want to watch them. It's so your first film with Bob is Roadhead from 98, and that's sort of that kind of collected footage of that you were describing using that kind of like Rotoscop. Is that what y'all refer to the program
as? That's what he called it. That.
Okay.
I mean, it was never really a program. It was just sort of something that we used. But yeah, it was a road trip from New York back to Austin, Texas, where I had a house and we were done with the MTV thing. And it was actually, the deal that we made with MTV was let us use their equipment and get first look for this as a series for MTV. They're very supportive at that time. And we made the film, and I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but it really is just sort of random people that we met. And they loved it, except they hated the people that we were interviewing.
Oh.
And they were like, you know, we want you to do stars,
sure,
pop stars and stuff like that. And you know, we were young and punkish, and we were like, no way, that's lame. You know, we like want to do real people and all that stuff. And it does, like, that was really our objective. Again, our objective was to take, you know, ordinary people and really and rise that up, you know, and to sort of see where we could take that and make that interesting. Whereas you take performers and, you know, they're already kind of extraordinary, and people already have this set of expectations when you see somebody, you know, no matter who it is, whether you're a fan or not, you have that sort of set of expectations coming into it. And we just weren't really that interested in that. And so we just sort of thought, well, we're living in Austin. We don't need to make a television series. We don't need to do all that stuff. Let's just make stuff on our own and see where it goes.
So at around the same time, we have like the Snack and Drink short, I guess, right? It's like this 3-minute piece from 99 you did. And it's kind of interesting because when you watch that, I don't recognize it specifically, but I recognize it as an artifact from that time. And I've probably actually even like come across it at the Museum of Modern Art, which it's like on the permanent installation there. And I'm just kind of curious do you think something about that, the magic of that happening, I don't know exactly when it was put in the permanent collection, but kind of solidifying it as like a 90s artifact. Do you think that kind of shifted how you thought about like the aesthetic you had been working on in your process? And you're like, oh, this is where we follow it from here forward? Or was it still kind of gestating and growing? You know, like what was it like to just be at the end of, you know, the century thinking about?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that like Bob and I just started hitting this groove, and it was a very sort of successful and fulfilling collaboration at that time. And you know, we were living together at that moment. The way that Snack and Drink and Roadhead happened was we put flyers up. This is really pre-social media and all that stuff. So we're putting flyers up at coffee shops and saying like, hey, come into to my house. And we had 2 computers there, and we would sort of teach people, and they would just sort of draw over that little segment. And no matter what they did, that's what ended up in that film. So there's like parts of you know, Snack and Drink that may be shots that I don't necessarily love, but we weren't making that sort of judgment call at that time. It was like whatever people did, that was it. That was part of the experiment. That was the way that we were sort of exploring, you know, this sort of craft. And, you know, I'd say for like 2 or 3 years, we were just really on a roll and not thinking about that stuff. It was a great pleasure to be a part of that museum, but it was a surprise. I mean, like Snack and Drink at the time felt more like a tech demo in a way. We were playing with full color for the first time. If you see Roadhead, you have a couple of color sequences in between the sort of the black and white line drawings. and they weren't even really full frame. So this was really our look at sort of full frame color things. And it was the first time we met Ryan, who people don't know Snack and Drink what it's about. It's a short film about the first time that we meet Ryan, who is autistic. He's an autistic teenager, and he just invites us to go to a convenience store with him. It's all very, like, none of it was planned, hadn't met him before. What you see is exactly our first meeting with him, you know, in that moment. And again, I'm a poor judge of how people will respond to something that I'm involved with. And I was surprised that it went to festivals, it got attention, it got into the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection, you know, and that was sort of a surprise. But at the same time, it sort of felt like it wasn't a crowded playing field. There wasn't very much independent computer animation at that time. When did Toy Story come out?
95.
Like early to mid 90s?
Yeah,
mid 90s. So this isn't really that much longer after that. And, you know, it seems something that was pretty much unattainable to people to do computer animated shorts independently, much less two guys who didn't have jobs. We're sitting in a house in Austin, Texas, right? I mean, these were made for almost nothing. It was just time that we put into them. But that just sort of, it was just one of those flows. It was that time in life where you kind of get into these grooves, and it was just a very nice period.
I found it, I wonder if this is actually true, but I just copy and pasted it from somewhere, but that Snack and Drink, it was showing at a festival and it tied with A Bug's Life for second place. This is the Pre-Ars Electronica Festival, I think. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
As a fact?
Of course,
okay.
Yeah, it's in Linz.
It's just such an interesting pairing.
They flew us to Austria and gave us money too. And I was like, well, what do you get for this? Are you going to put it on TV or something? And they're like, no. And I was like, well, what's the money for? And they're like, do good work. And I was like, no, seriously, what's the money for? You know, it's like a couple $1,000. And it was like cash. They give us like euros. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was such a surprise to me that like someone was supporting, you know, storytelling in that way that was really about giving a venue for it and really just sort of, you know, supporting that. And that was just a fantastic experience. I mean, again, I think that a lot of it's hard work, but a lot of people work really hard. Sometimes it's being in the right place at the right time and really finding that there are kind of like institutions and people who really help out and make a real huge difference in the grand scheme of things. And that's one of those instances, I think, where, you know, we felt supported and validated at that time. And it was at a time when we weren't, you know, that came from outside. It was also that real, you know, like MTV, I think this was like after MTV kind of said, you know, we didn't do that series that they wanted. And you do start to second guess yourself. You start thinking like, well, maybe, you know, there's something wrong with me. And then to make something like Snack and Drink that was even more out there than Roadhead, and to get that sort of support from that was huge at that time. You know, when you're first starting out, you're looking for those, for that kind of validation,
yeah.
I think.
All right, before we hop into the 2000s, Caitlin is like the young, newer wave of like graphic.
That's so true. Thanks for noticing. I'm young and spry.
You know, when you look at this work, like whether you've come across it previously or not, or just this kind of era, things that were inspired by it, like where's that fit into like your art intake? Like, is this a style you were familiar with?
Not really.
Yeah.
I watched all of Roadhead and I freaking loved it. I just want to say that I thought it was really good. Never seen it before, but it reminds, and Snack and Drink, they just remind me of like my generation. And I'm like in elementary school, whatever, like watching like Flash cartoons were big. And there's not, I mean, that's a whole other thing with like many permutations unto itself stylistically and etc. But it reminds me of that. And I think that's a really nice crossover because there were a lot of people who were like making Flash cartoons on Newgrounds and like other places that very much had that like indie mentality. Like a lot of it was very experimental. So I definitely like experienced the appeal of that as a kid. Like thinking like these are so funny or like so weird, whatever, like you could just do whatever. And I love the idea still to this day of just making stuff in my house as a small group of people.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the spirit in which I came up.
Yeah, it's a spirit that there is not as much opportunity to exist in a lot of the other animation techniques we talk about, where there's like this grueling process of like character design and these other aspects that come into play that require more like organization or pre-planning and stuff. Whereas this, it's just so inspiring to hear you talk about your relationship with Bob, Tommy, and this like very simple template you created for yourselves. It wasn't overthought, and you like allowed other people, and that's such like just the essence of early collaboration, I think, when it goes well, and like clearly it did.
Yeah, and I think it was also sort of deconstructing the whole process and looking at it in a different way, and knowing that we couldn't do anything like Disney or anybody else, but looking at it and saying like, well, what can we do? You know, and honestly, just being willing to fail while doing it. I mean, when it's not a lot of money and it's just your own sweat equity, then you're allowed to fail. You know, now I find that that's sort of what I don't have that luxury so much now. You know, now I have bigger budgets and more, you know, like the failures are there's consequences to that. But at that time, it really was challenging that notion of character design and what you could do. And what we realized very early on is that the underlying reality of it, especially in sound, that gives you the ability to go anywhere visually that you want. It creates that continuity so that even if you're changing up the way a character looks in the middle of a shot, that the audience understands that's that same person because the voice is the same. And, you know, there's that, the mind's able to sort of fill in and build upon the images that you're seeing. So I think for me, what was really appealing was the uncanniness of that moment. And being able to sort of bridge, it is a hybrid between live action and animation, and that sort of liminal space, that was something that was very interesting to me. And it allows you sort of an ability of improvisation that's impossible in traditional animation.
Yeah. So, all right, let's look at the kind of waking life moment here. So had Richard Linklater seen some of this early work, and then this idea appeared? Like, how did that all come together?
Again, I'd been friends with Rick for a long time at this moment, and he had gone off and made, you know, some very successful films. I mean, like his first three were it was Slacker, Dazed and Confused, and Before Sunrise, right? And then he did like this huge Hollywood movie that was a Western called The Newton Boys, and it wasn't a great experience for him. And we were talking, and he was just like, I'm done with Hollywood. I don't ever want to depend on Hollywood again. And I was doing all the rotoscope stuff that we're doing. And again, this is the 90s. Digital cinematography was new, right? Nonlinear editing was new at that time. And we really embraced all that stuff. And I was using a lot of the consumer digital cameras to make, you know, Roadhead and Snack and Drink and all that stuff. So he started really asking me about the digital cameras and how, you know, he could get around and be more nimble again, really kind of looking at the Slacker model, which was made with very few people. And he had some ideas, and what eventually became Waking Life. At first, it wasn't going. He didn't really have this idea of what it would be. He just had an idea, and we just started talking. And eventually, he had seen the animation. We sort of settled on this sort of dreamlike state, and we sort of just started to. And it was he really influenced me in terms of. A lot of Rick's movies are sort of anti-dramatic. I don't know if
love that.
Fair to say, but his, you know, the way he constructs a scene, it's kind of like he kind of cuts out where most filmmakers would start. Like his scenes are either the head or the tail of the meat of the scene that most people are looking for, right? And he has a great ear for naturalistic dialogue and real people, you know, like when you see his movies are populated by real people. So that was very much in parallel with what, you know, we were doing with the animation, just sort of real people and elevating that. And we kind of realized as we talked more and more about Waking Life, it was really a kitchen sink concept. It was like all these, you know, separate ideas. We knew it was going to be episodic. We knew that would sort of, we could build on this notion of constantly changing styles design and things like that. And we knew that the visuals would sort of elevate it. On one level, I don't know if Waking Life is really tolerable as a live action film. It's a bit, philosophy 101, but animated, it transcends even what it's talking about. So I think that that's really kind of where it came, and very quickly we did that. And shooting it was wonderful. It was Rick and myself on camera. We had a sound person. We had like Wiley Wiggins, who was the main actor, and whoever the actor was that day, and maybe a PA. That's how we filmed Waking Life.
Yeah.
It was like the best production ever because it was just so small and so intimate.
So since this is a film more people are going to be familiar with just because it had like a wider release and everything, could you talk a little bit about, some of the choices of, as you adapt something to Rotoscope and, the line work you choose to do, like there's something very particular about the way you do it in the projects you're associated with. Like how are you making those choices or facilitating them to a team about, like you said, with the animation, it makes it like tolerable in a way that live action wouldn't be. Like, how are you designing the rotoscoping work at this point? Like, or how are you thinking about it?
Well, if you're talking about Waking Life, there was an incredible amount of faith on the artists that we picked to bring this to life in terms of the animators. I mean, it was great. At this point, we had an office, we had money to pay people, but we still had the spirit of giving ownership to the artist and the animators. And because it's Rotoscope, it's a little bit different than regular animation. And what we were able to do was actually go outside of some of the more traditional people who knew animation. Of course, if they know animation, that's always better. But we had to basically train everybody. So it didn't really, and if you knew animation really well, you had to unlearn some things in order to do the rotoscoping thing. And we were also able to really, what at that time, what I noticed is that people who were really good illustrators and had a strong sense, people who were really good at life drawing were the people that did really well with the rotoscope. And what it is, it's just like all animation, it's about the command of the line. And, at every single point, I always just tell everybody, like, imagine drawing an eyebrow, and then you have to draw that eyebrow every single frame, So you start making those design choices are kind of, they're about I always think about it as poetry. Like, you want to say the most with the least amount of words in poetry. And so for rotoscoping, it really was, how can I get the essence of this character in the least amount of line strokes? And what we would do, sort of like how you cast somebody for a role, you just start casting the animators for the segments. So we knew that every single segment had a different feeling, was a different thing, and was going to have a completely different look. So we'd sort of talk it over with all the animators, find out who really was sparking to it, who really wanted to do it. That's like one of the fundamental things, like who's excited about doing the scene, who's going to really take it on and take ownership and really elevate it beyond anything that we could think about, and sort of give them the resources and the support in order to make that and guide them along that process, the same way you would with an actor. So that was sort of the way that we thought about it. It was a collaboration, and like all collaborations, you expect it to elevate whatever idea that you have.
Anything? Keep going.
It just sounds great. Something I find that's rare. I'm curious, like how much that mentality kind of continues on to like a Pallotta, the more modern films that you've worked on. If that's still something that's happening.
I would love to talk about that, and I hope that that's still there. But also at the time, just to sort of put it in context, because I think it's difficult to really imagine. Because Waking Life came out in 2001. We probably were working on it in '99. We made that movie for $1.5 million. So we made an entire feature for $1.5 million in a time when no one thought it was possible to make it, under 50 million or whatever. at that period. And you were seeing the sort of huge growth because of Toy Story and Pixar and everything in terms of 3D animation. So first of all, there's a real interest in the industry. And I didn't realize it at the time, but everybody in LA wanted to talk to me because they were like, who figured out how to make a computer animated film for $1.5 million?
Right.
You know, that was like the main thing. And it turns out that it was the first independently produced computer animated film to be released by a distributor. So that was, you know, it was cool. But at the time, and even now still, $1.5 million for a feature is pretty low risk. And nobody kind of knew what we were doing. And so there wasn't a lot of oversight either. So I think that those times when you get that opportunity, and that's really what, you know, Rick is great because he's established, but he's willing to take these risks. And he continues to do so today, even with Boyhood, which will, you know, you can talk later, huge risk for that movie. But he takes it because that's just the kind of storyteller that he is. But that was very unique in terms of really no one really knowing what we're doing and no real expectations for that. And that allowed us to really experiment and play. And I think that comes out.
And I just want to point out one thing at this little era before we kind of hop ahead to like stuff that's like easier to, you know, Apollo, like things that people are watching currently and, you know, Undone also. But so with Waking Life, I feel like there's this moment because I was about to graduate college at this time. I remember this movie coming out, obviously, like a 40-year-old dude, loved Richard Linklater. This movie just kind of let somebody new into the room of like what a movie could look like. And that's not just for me because, this movie won a bunch of awards. Like it's kind of like what is it? I feel like I wrote it down. Okay, so like Film Critics Circle, Best Animated Feature, National Society for Film Critics, Best Experimental Film, and Venice Film Festival, Best Film. And I point those out because they're all like different categories. So it's like, and we're going to get to this a little later in the conversation, but it's sort of like, what do we do with this cool new thing? And how does it fit in here with everybody? How do we like get along with it? We want you here, but you know, I don't know if there was a feeling of that at the time, but it's just kind of, I remember feeling that. I'm like, wow, I love to draw. I love movies. This is like an interesting amalgam of them. So I don't know if that was in the air.
Yeah. But... Well, when you finish a project, you have to sort of reflect on it and you have to create a narrative and you have to explain the reasons why you do what you did. But as you know, this is all about process and flow. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to really, really trust my instincts because I realize afterwards I can retroactively guess why I was doing the things that I was doing or whatever. But a lot of this was really just, it was that zeitgeist. It was that time. It was the people that it was the environment that we were in. It was the people that we were working with. It all felt very natural and very organic and very fun. And we were just having a good time, you know, making it. And we did talk about it. And I mean, there were very specific things about going against the traditional character design and production design and all these things, and kind of like trying to break away from the structure of animated films and the lack of improvisation, the lack of experimentation that you can do because it takes so long and because it's so expensive. We knew that we had found a way to anybody else could have done it, but we sort of realized that there was a thread that people were ignoring, and we just started to pull that thread. And that's sort of what came of it. And still, I mean, I still feel like we're doing it. It still feels like, to me, that animation is a platform that can be, I think we're just scratching the surface of it still.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a wonderful place to really, and I hope it keeps on growing. I wish it's not growing fast.
Okay. So as we kind of, I'm just trying to be efficient with our use of time here. Caitlin, I'm curious if this is something that just missed me completely. Music videos, early 2000s, the idea of how do you say it? Macchina Mia music video?
I don't know how you pronounce that, but I know what you're talking about.
Machinima.
Okay. Sorry.
Machinima.
We're like, that seems like more of a you wave than like me wave.
Potentially, I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar. It's like probably stuff that I saw and didn't know enough to like retain. Like now I would be like, oh yeah, that was super formative or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the time I was just like a melt-brained little kid like sneaking into the computer room to like be, screw around and watch videos on the internet. But
yeah. So if you're out of the loop like me, machinima music videos, Tommy, it's like you're just basically using a computer engine to create like animation in real time in a lot of ways, right? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a lot like what we're doing with virtual production today, the Unreal Engine, all that stuff. But at that time, none of that existed. But we were from Texas, and, John Carmack, who's a programmer for id Software at that time, who's, an all-star programmer, programmed Doom and Quake, all these first-person shooters that were huge at that time. I loved all that stuff, but I was the kind of person who I would go into those worlds and I got bored of shooting people very quickly, but I loved the environment. I loved being able to explore that environment. I mean, everything that they're talking about the metaverse, I keep on thinking like that was 20 years ago, man. Go into the first person shooters. It looks better than the metaverse does now.
So true.
And again, I thought like, well, this is real-time animation that's happening. And again, this thought went off in my mind that was like, well, here's a way that, again, you can improvise very easily and you can create real-time animations and you don't have to, part of it is that you could just do shots over and over again, almost like it's live action until you found it, the way that you really liked it. And in fact, some people like Rooster Teeth, who did Red versus Blue also at that time, that's how they were using it. That Rooster Teeth became because they were doing machinima and with the Halo.
I actually didn't know that, and moment. I am familiar with that. First, that's for sure. That was, but I didn't know it was through that that means. That's awesome.
So again, it was just a way to sort of take the technology that was really built for something else, but bend it, for a different form of storytelling where it wasn't just about shooting people, but telling stories.
And just for a couple points of reference, these were both directed by you, I'm pretty sure, right? The 07 video for Destiny, and then
In the waiting
line.
Yeah.
That's also
so Destiny was
right?
rotoscoped. Yeah. So Destiny was rotoscoped, and then In the Waiting Line was machinima.
Okay.
Did that. People loved the rotoscope one way more than the machinima one, because the rotoscope one was really sweet. It was really it was a bizarre. I think it was shot after September 11th in New York when I was living there, and it was in the winter. I don't remember exactly, but December or January, and it was like I was shooting. I knew that I wanted to shoot people incognito. Like I didn't want anybody to know I was actually shooting them, and so it just so happened that there was a day of like great weather, and it was after the tragedy of September 11th, and all these people were like just out, and it was like the one day I had to film this reference material, and we went out, and it's just my neighborhood, and it was magical. It was really fun. But then when I did the machinima one, I was in a darker place in my life, and it really was about a robot going through an existential crisis. And it just seemed much colder, I think. But I love the machinima one. I love In the Waiting Line, and I love, Destiny as well. But clearly MTV embraced Destiny with open arms. And I got a call from Madonna's manager, and they're like, Madonna wants to do a music video and all that stuff. But then, after the In the Waiting Line, I just sort of decided that music videos, well, it was actually Madonna's manager. They were like, we want to make sure that you're dedicated to being a music video director. And I thought about it, and I thought like, I'm not really dedicated to be a music video director. And so I had to decline at that moment. But then after In the Waiting Line, I was sort of like, well, I'm not really, also the record industry changed. So they used to have budgets for music videos. And then after like this big fallout in like 2002, suddenly there was no more money for music videos. And sort of, and they have to be quick. They're like commercials. You can't make a music video for a couple of months for the most part. It has to be done quickly. Right. So that was it.
And now we kind of arrive at like A Scanner Darkly. That's a movie, you know?
Yes. And I'll be honest, we've talked about it on this show. I don't really remember it, but I have seen it. I probably saw it maybe a few years after it came out, so it's just been a long time at this point. Mm-hmm. But I remember seeing ads for that and being like, oh my God, like, what is the deal with this movie? Like, in a very positive way, because I hadn't seen anything like it. And honestly, you still don't really see that much like it. So, like, I rewatched the trailer for it the other day, and I feel like if you have any familiarity with it whatsoever, like, you can't see a frame from that and be like, oh, what is that? Like, I don't know. Like, you know what it is. Right. It's very iconic looking.
So, yeah, that's actually a good point. So, you know, at this point, like, what does your team look like for this? Because it almost feels, at least to us, is just like the common viewers, it's such a singular path of this style of rotoscoping, and not just the stories you're telling, but like the way it looks and the way the look evolves with these projects. Do you have like this specific team that's kind of growing and developing, which makes it be this almost singular journey to follow? Like Caitlin said, there's not a lot of stuff that looks like A Scanner Darkly or Apollo 10.5.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I couldn't do A Scanner Darkly again today. Like, what we do is kind of, you can't reproduce it. It really is about the talent and the people that you're working with at that time. And there is a core group of people that kind of come and go. Like, there's overlap in different, things. I mean, Bob and I, our partnership dissolved at the Scanner Darkly. It was a very difficult production. It was sort of opposite of Waking Life. We were very ambitious. I think we tried to do too much. But I looked at it very closely before we started to do Apollo. And I really I knew the bar was high with A Scanner Darkly. And I looked at it, and when I looked at it, I was like, oh my God, we were so insane to do what we did. And I looked at some of the stuff, like Robert Downey Jr. is wearing a camouflage t-shirt.
Yes, exactly.
And like, we did it, like I would never do that again, but like, we did it then, and again, the cast is, Scanner Darkly, when it came out, it was kind of a box office failure and not even that much of a critical success. We had a few people who were really, talking about it, but I mean, it was sort of like, it was not, it's viewed much more positively now. It had a second life. It has a cult following, and we have an amazing cast. We had Keanu Reeves, Robert Downey Jr., Woody Harrelson, Winona Ryder. These are like in a super low budget movie. That movie at that time was $8.5 million for everything. So that's like, Keanu basically donated his time in that. Like, they all did. Like, Robert Downey Jr. couldn't get hired. This is before Iron Man. The Warner Brothers were like, oh, you can't have Robert Downey Jr. because we can't get insurance on him. And I was like, for what, man? You guys spend more money on craft services for a movie than this. This is a really low risk production for you guys. And they're like, to their credit, they're like, oh yeah, right. We're used to doing movies that cost $80 million, $100 million. They weren't even on the line for the whole 8.5. There was an equity investor that was doing half of it. They were on the line for $4 million. So they said yes. So we had Robert Downey Jr. come in, who was, at that time, no one would hire him. Yeah. But he's an incredible actor, and that's all we were like, we kept on looking for somebody else, but they were like, come on, it's Robert Downey. That's who it is. So.
Right. It is. When you look back, it is this group of people that have they were popular then, but they've like skyrocketed now, where it's makes it a really interesting little artifact. They're like, oh, they were all in this like really weird.
Oh, I love it, because I actually had to completely forgotten. I think I didn't realize who he was at the time, Robert Downey Jr., because to me, Iron Man was his first movie. That came out at a perfect time for me and my friends to go to the movie. So yeah, it was super interesting.
So, all right. Yeah. Now, I want to get to some of the conversation we were talking about earlier. So let's kind of keep going a little bit here. I like to talk about Undone a little bit because that's like a series that's going on right now. And with this project, which I didn't realize till I was looking into it, that it was developed by Kate Purdy and what's his name? Raphael Bob Wakesberg. Am I saying that right? From BoJack Horseman.
Yeah.
Which is cool. 'Cause it's
Animation.
What's that?
Animation.
Yeah, it's all connected.
I've heard of that guy.
But also, the scripts for BoJack are so good. Like the dialogue in some of those episodes is so amazing. And Undone is really good too. So, how did you get involved with that? Was that like they wanted to do it in that style, and they brought you in, or?
Well, yeah. So Noel Bright, who was the EP on BoJack. As well as this sort of like gave me a call. And I think like BoJack was in its third season at that time. And I hadn't watched it. I hadn't watched any of the first two seasons. But I so happened I watched a couple of episodes one night and Noel called me the next day. And I was like, he's like, hey, this is Noel Bright. I'm, executive producer on BoJack Horseman or whatever. And I was like, no fucking way. I was like, what the hell are you guys doing? And he's like, what do you mean? It's like, I just watched BoJack Horseman for the first time last night, and now you're calling me. Are you monitoring my viewing habits? And he said, he's like, no, they don't even let us know who views anything, which is true. Now that I've worked with Netflix, they don't let you know anything. But I thought that was really amazing. And they worked with Hisko Hulsing, who directed it. He had worked with me. I'd worked with him on another project, and he's a painter and an animator. And I did this documentary that had animated segments in it. It was all 3D. It wasn't rotoscope, but I had him paint all the backgrounds for that. And I was familiar with him. And they were talking to him, and he said, well, as soon as they said, maybe it'll be rotoscoped or whatever, they were like, you got to call Tommy. So that's kind of how that came out. But again, it wasn't, when they first talked to me, they were pretty clear that they didn't know that if it was going to be rotoscoped. They were still sort of discovering what it was. And there's a problem with rotoscoping, which is that it's very time intensive. You can do, for instance, 3D animation, you can do it much faster if you really want to. But there's not a lot of workarounds, with the rotoscope. And so I couldn't really figure out how to do it quickly in terms of a TV thing. And we were going around, and I think we were in Utrecht in the Netherlands at the time. Hisko's from the Netherlands. And I just we were on a train, and all of a sudden I realized if I split it up, I could kind of do it twice as fast. If I had two different teams and I just sort of split up the whole process, and I had one team kind of just working on the outlines, just really sort of capturing the performance and doing that. And then everything else was done in another team. I could stagger it, and I could basically do it in half the time that I had done it before, which was always, I did it sort of more linearly in one place. Yeah. So once I realized that, and I kind of did the math, I realized we could do it as a TV show. And then that's how that happened. And again, it really was sort of the writing of BoJack, the sort of, I just sort of, at the core of it, I think BoJack Horseman is about, a man having a midlife crisis in Hollywood. So I'm there, that's me. So I absolutely loved that show. And so, just on the writing and Kate, some of my favorite episodes were written by Kate, like Time Zero. If you're going to watch one BoJack episode, watch that one. It's amazing. And, the concept of Undone, a lot of the subject matter that I've been attracted to really is about portraying a subjective reality, whether it's waking life where you're having a lucid dream, or Scanner Darkly where the person's having a split personality disorder and doing drugs. Undone is she going insane, or is she really seeing her dead father come back to life and telling her how to manipulate time? And it was Texas based. I love that. So it just made sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just feels like I was under the impression, without knowing much, that you had just been there at the beginning, maybe even like conceptualizing, because it does make sense as a thing that would be like part of your like creative journey. Now here's where,
that was,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That was the nice thing about it. I mean, but also the great thing is I'm hard to get a hold of, and there is that sort of body of work where people know like, oh, this would be sort of in that wheelhouse, and so it comes to me. So I'm very lucky in that way.
So here's where Caitlin and I enter into this your story slightly.
Well.
So on our show, obviously every week we kind of pick a movie specifically to talk about often, or we have a guest pick a thing or a movie to talk about. And we had done Mars and Beyond from Disney, which is kind of this like NASA fueled like Disney short from the 50s. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Kind of an educational piece. Yeah. But it's a space exploration thing. And then I was like, it would be a good follow-up. We should do this Apollo 10.5 movie that's on Netflix. I haven't watched like the Linklater Rotoscope stuff. That's back. Like, let's check that out and see. And I had no idea what I was going to feel about it, because I think like it was like Scanner Darkly. We'd seen it at some point, but we had a great time watching it and talking about it.
I loved it. And again, it was one of the only movies that I put on, and my husband just like came in and then just sat and watched the whole thing with me. Like we watched stuff together, but when I'm like, I'm watching this for the podcast type stuff, no. And he just came in and just never left. And I thought that was great. So we enjoyed that film together. It was really nice.
I can feel the same way. There was something about that movie. I mean, part of it might be the story, the charm of it. But there's something about the rotoscoping language. And I don't know if we can hopefully talk a little bit about like Minnow Mountain and Submarine and those roles and the language, the visual language they bring to it. But suddenly the storytelling made more sense in a way to me, like the different translating of mediums, like when we're watching television or when we're seeing a present day moment, and the textures you apply, the way you talk about news and all that stuff. We went on and on for like 2.5 hours, obviously. But I think we'd like to know specifically, like what changed within the team, specifically like planning this project, and what kind of, what elevated it for y'all with the visual storytelling of it.
Well, contextually, you have to realize that the production of this was done during the lockdown. So luckily the whole like Rick had been percolating this movie in his head for a long time, for years, right? He didn't know what the form would be. His default is to sort of start at live action. But it was a film that kind of didn't work in his head as a live action movie. He kind of tried to get it off the ground, but he kind of knew that there was something wrong with that. And I mean, we're friends, so I don't like sit there and go like every time he's working on this new script, like, can we animate it? Can we, whatever. But I mean, like this particular one, when he was telling me about it, I was sort of thinking like I kind of want to work on this movie because he and I grew up in the same place, like really suburb of NASA, right outside of Houston. And it was a subject that was, close to me. But really the way that it works, it's a story about, a young boy's coming of age in the late 60s, but it's told by his older self looking back at that moment. So just the fact that it's dealing with like memory and nostalgia and all the stuff I knew, again, the subjective reality and being able to use that and play with that in terms of the rotoscoping and really, like I said earlier, finding those liminal moments or those uncanny moments where, memory or dreams or fantasies can kind of blend seamlessly together. It sort of seemed like it was the perfect thing to tell in this story. And then as we were going through that and we were sort of collecting material for that time, we just really fell in love with the sort of the scrapbook approach of it. Like not really thinking, it's going to be like this, but as I started getting in these photos and these videos of that era, I started to realize, the Kodachrome look is so distinctive, or the scratchiness of the film reels from the analog days was the degradation. And I just sort of thought, like, you know, the thing about animation, particularly computer animation, is that I can kind of tell you what year the animation was made just by the technology. I can see the math in computer animation. I can see the simulations that they're using in terms of like hair or water, you know, and things like that. But so what I wanted to do was with this project was to really go back and of course there's a great love of the older animation in it, but also the older animation that people don't talk about so much, which was the Saturday morning cartoons, which I watched more of that than anything else at that time. I was explaining this to my daughter, you know, at 12, I was like, well, you know what? Like there was a time Saturday morning where there was only like a couple of channels, and the only animation you could really see every week was, you know, on these couple of channels for this very specific time. And that was a really wonderful period in my life, and part of that memory, you know, so we kind of wanted to really, we knew that was the way that we wanted to do it. We didn't want to do high tech. We didn't want to really go out. And in fact, the rotoscope on Apollo 10.5 is very different than the rotoscope that we had done, even on Scanner Darkly. And Waking Life, both of those had interpolation within it. So we'd go, you draw a line, an eyebrow, you could go up a couple of frames, draw another line, and the computer would fill it in, right? There'd be that interpolation. If you see those movies, that waviness comes from the interpolation, which is very computery. And I love that look. And I will probably do it again at some point. But for this, we really wanted to go back to a straight 2D pipeline. So the other thing that we wanted to do was, because we're doing it that way, we did it all on tubes, which of course is the way all that animation that I grew up with was done as well. So it was really kind of applying these retro techniques to the sort of more modern telling of it.
Yeah, I feel like when we were talking about it, just like the nostalgia of just the look and feel with that was just there.
Oh God, yeah. And like, I just love the way all of the news clips and like television scenes are handled. This feels a little tangential, but I remember talking about this on the episode that like my background was in documentary. Like I worked for The Atlantic for like 4 years at the start of my career, essentially did a lot of like documentary adjacent stuff. And it's funny how much, usually just due to like very fast turnarounds, we you know, you do everything you can to like save time, but also to make things more realistic. So there's a lot of rotoscoping adjacent stuff that you would do, even if you're just making like a quick, you know, portrait animation of some important figure. You're making like a historical video about whatever. But I loved it because it was just so cool seeing, there's like watching football on TV, and the way that clip of football is treated stylistically is so different, and it's like very unique. Yeah. And I just felt, I was like, this makes so much sense why this type of animation was a perfect solution for this movie, because it makes it feel like you remembering you watching that. And it was just like such a beautiful little thing.
Yeah.
And the whole movie's full of that.
There's and thinking about it also is a cinematic approach. You don't have the language of a lens in the same way. Like things aren't in and out of focus. There's not depth of field in the same way. So I would find myself drawn to things like the label, like the graphic design. Like I love the scene where you go through literally every TV show that was on. I just love a giant list, I guess. But you get all the title cards exactly right. And like you were saying with doing the camouflage of somebody's outfit, like these indulgences that we put animators through at the whim of a director, it's like here it feels worth it in a different way to make artists do all that, because it's just so charming and joyous in a way to lovingly recreate. And all the board games too. That it was just so cool. So I don't know. There's just a tone in the decision making that felt like different in some way, I guess.
Oh, that's great. I mean, in terms of the depth of field, we tried it, right? And what happens is it becomes too realistic. As soon as you sort of like blur it, it looks, you know, a little bit too realistic. So what we tried to do was really in terms of detail. So you'll find the things where we really want you to be looking, there's a higher level of detail, and then as you go back, you know, it's more abstract. And I think, again, we could even take that further. And I look forward, you know, to next projects to really playing with that. Because, again, I think that animation, there's a very strong business reason for that. Like, people are going to tend towards what is successful in the mainstream way, and they don't have the ability to make those mistakes like I talked about earlier, or to experiment. With the exception of like Spider-Man, I would say that was really the Spider-Verse. I was sort of, when I went and watched it in the movie theater, and I was sort of blown away by that one, because that was like the first one that I sort of felt like this is a total mainstream thing, but clearly they were having a blast making this. And when I was watching it, I was like, I hope that they've seen my work, because that's sort of what I was doing, you know. And I was just and I thought, like, I can't imagine that anybody's going to want to go see a live action superhero movie after
Totally,
this.
yeah.
But as it turns out, they totally wanted to see live action. Like, the Spider-Man movie that came out was like 3 times more successful, but the animation blew me away in that show. So, like, a lot of times, and that sort of gave me hope. And I can't wait for the next one. But I love that, and I love that they were taking that risk with that. And there were so many different styles. They were playing with the sort of the frame rate of the different characters, the different 2D, 3D. They were mixing it all together. It was great.
Caitlin, have you heard about the Spider-Verse movie? I don't know if that's something that's
Shut
crossed
up,
your.
Yeah. I talk a lot about how much I love that movie.
Favorite movie ever.
It's so good. It's the best movie. But I totally agree. That is why that was a movie that I went and saw in theaters, and I was like, oh my god, like, animation is new again. Not that, and I wasn't bored of animation, you know, but I guess you just kind of were like, I see what I see. Animation, I go to see it, and it looks like this. And then that, and I was like, it's embarrassing in a way, but I get goosebumps when I watch that movie, and like the opening, like, kind of, you know, credit, like, it's just starting to kick up kind of a thing, and I'm like, yeah, this movie's awesome. Like, let's go. So, I agree.
So let's say cartoon animation literacy maybe is an all-time, thanks to things like that movie. I think Apollo 10.5 is playing into this too. People understand how to read animation a lot better than ever before. Yet here 20 years out from Awakened Life, you're still like the new person in the room in the way, and that people don't know how to really think about rotoscoping. So I feel like this is something, because it's topical, we should talk about it a little bit, and you kind of brought it up. So the Academy Awards, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so recently we found out that Apollo 10.5 is not eligible in the animation category for the Academy Awards, which was a shock to me because it's animated.
Sure.
But I mean, it really speaks to is the bias against Rotoscope. And the bias, you know, reads like this: because you're using reference, you're tracing, and because you're tracing, you're not bringing it to life, therefore you're not animating it. And that's been, and again, I'm not a scholar, but I do know that rotoscoping was patented in 1915 by Fleischer, and that and at the time Fleischer was much a larger and more successful studio than Walt Disney. And during the sort of the golden days of Walt Disney, they weren't able to rotoscope, and Fleischer was. So all the original Popeye, Betty Boop, all that stuff was rotoscoped. Since then, of course, you've seen, and I'm sure that the audience has, all the reference videos and photos and films from the Disney films that they were doing. And they made the distinction between reference and rotoscoping, you know, probably for legal reasons. But there is there's that bias in the animation community that rotoscope is just bad and not real. And I think that's sort of what they were, you know, doing in terms of denying us eligibility, which we are appealing at this, by the way. And hopefully by the time this comes out, we'll have an appeal, and hopefully they'll accept it as animation, because clearly it is. I mean, if you're drawing something frame by frame, it's animation.
That's pretty much the sum of
right.
So.
And beyond the line work, it seems like the way it's often discussed, because like last week we were talking about the 1973 Disney Robin Hood adaptation, and the way people love to point out how they're reusing like the figures and doing the same dance from the other thing. And it's like, well, yeah, we all use assets in our industry jobs and like to get the job done. But people love that they can see that. But it all has so much to do with the line work. And I was just looking into rotoscoping as a process. So like it shows up in Secret of Nim, which is like a favorite movie of Caitlin and I's, and even American Tail, that like 80s Spielbergy John Bluth, and where they're using it for like matte shots and visual effects. And I think people don't think of it as that part of the language as well, right? Like technically that's still rotoscoping to represent shadow and light and other like environmental effects, right? People want to tie it to line work exclusively.
I don't think that I'm like breaking new ground by saying this. I don't know who's listening to this and is going to be like, whoa, yeah, Keelan, totally. But like animation has such a a brand problem in these circles, because it's like nobody cares about it. This sounds very like a lot. I have found that a lot of people who are not animators in any way do not care about animation and don't understand it at all. Even if they like it, it's not that they think it's bad or they're like, ew, I don't care about that. It's that they have no understanding of the processes that go into it, but they don't really care to learn. And they probably don't need to. But like, it's the same thing to me where Disney's coming out with like my live action Lion King. And I'm like, are you sure though? Because I'm pretty sure it's not live action. I'm pretty sure that animators made this. They just made it, so that you can see the twinkle of the sun in Simba's eye. Like, it's not, it's an animated thing. Mm-hmm. And I find it kind of sad that animation would like infight in this way, when I'm like, a lot of animators face that kind of like discrimination. And like, not to even tie this to another thing, but like all these studios right now are laying off their animation departments, like after production kind of got them through a lot of the pandemic, and animators came up with a lot of like really interesting solutions, to keep things going. Now like Netflix is laying off 30 people in animation, like Warner Brothers is laying off 26% of the people, like folding Cartoon Network into this other thing. Like, it's pretty rough. So basically, I think it would be, I don't really have a solution, but like there is no literacy for that stuff. And I really wish, like, it would be nice if we could all just kind of be like, this is really hard work. And it actually is work, and it requires artistry, and it requires talent. And we should just kind of recognize that instead of categorizing it like, oh, don't put, because like they won't put animated movies most of the time in the other categories either. It's just like, you go in the animated box, and it's just.
Well, we could put this in for Best Picture, no problem. Again, that's kind of weird. And my question is, who do they think that, like, do they think I'm trying to trick somebody? Like, does the Academy not have enough faith in its voters who are filmmakers, that I'm somehow so brilliant through sleight of hand, I can make them think it's an animated film, and trick them into voting for something in a different category that it's not. Like, I don't understand why there is even somebody who's making a subjective decision about what is or isn't animation. Why do they even need that? Is my first question. Secondly, the state of animation, like, are you going to tell me that somebody who does 3D animation and uses all kinds of simulations, like, so you're going to question it, like, all the hair was hand drawn in Apollo 10.5. All the lighting was hand drawn in that. You're going to tell me that 3D animated films that they're doing that as well? Are they using simulations to do that? Any water ripple that you see, hand drawn in Apollo 10.5. Yeah. We could have used 3D animation there. We didn't. We chose to our approach was bespoken. It really was like, let's avoid any 3D unless it's absolutely necessary, and any sort of simulations or automation. We really wanted to have a handmade approach to the film. So, I would happily compare shot by shot with any other movie that's won an Academy Award, and see who, they're equivalent. It all comes from people's imagination. All of those choices are design choices. All of it's laborious, And again, it should be that they should respect the animators who worked on this. There was almost 200 people who worked on this for almost 2 years. I'm going to tell them that they aren't animators now. It's bizarre to me.
Yeah.
But I think what it means is that there just needs to be a larger discussion and transparency within the industry, and it needs to be updated. The technology is changing faster than our ability to really understand it or talk about it. But my hope is through their denial of of this as an animated project that it will cause a conversation, and that people will talk about that, and eventually, once it's public and we have sort of an updated notion of what it is, it's not just the technique, it's also what you're making the movie about. The Academy pretty much is a family film category, and it's pretty much dominated by Disney Pixar. That's clear, demonstratable, but we all love those movies, but I think we all, and probably everybody who's listening to this, thinks about animation beyond just that very limited definition of what an animated film is. And we all want to see that expanded. So hopefully this will be a positive thing.
Yeah, I'm feeling good.
All right. Yes. I just think this is such an awkward follow-up. I agree. I feel like I don't want to keep you for too long, but you're basically touching on this too. But yeah, like a lot of people in the world are adult animation fans, even of those like the Disney Pixar category. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that don't have kids. Not me or Ira, certainly. Not us. That love these movies, and will continue to love them. And the song and dance people have to do to kind of like justify that in a way when it's like, these are film. Like, this is a way of making films. Like, animation isn't a genre. It's a medium. Like, it's a way that I tell a story, and I can tell a really scary and like violent story if I want to or whatever. Or I can tell like a really family friendly, kid adventure story, whatever. You can do literally anything with it. So don't put it in a box. Open that box up.
Yeah. Get in that box.
Climb in the box.
Yeah. Or destroy the box.
Get rid of the box,
yeah.
I think. Yeah, put that box in the recycling.
That's that 90s punk attitude coming back.
I think that all that stuff it's a good aid, and there'll be a lot of stuff where a general audience won't know the difference between a filter or some sort of automated process. But I always believe that intent comes through in terms of storytelling. Like anytime you make something, I've always had that faith that even though somebody doesn't know, it's hitting them on that sort of subconscious level that, oh yeah, that is kind of hand drawn. That is, that did come from somebody's imagination and hard work and effort and skill. I do believe in that still very much. But I'm also, when you asked like what I was going to do next, I'm looking a lot at anime right now. And
really?
what I love about anime is, again, when anime started, they couldn't compete with Disney and companies like that. So they created basically cheats. And the cheats that they would have became a language and a storytelling language. And they started to create their own form and style and method of animation. And I love that. And I think anime is very exciting in a lot of different ways right now. And I love how 2D is making a comeback, which is great.
Yeah.
I'm seeing so much more 2D stuff that I like. And there's a lot of 3D stuff that looks great now, that has a more organic feeling and 2D, almost to the point where I'm kind of like, what is this going on? Right. When I see more traditional computer animation, I can really see the math in it. I'm getting to that point where I'm not able to see the math in a lot of really well done animation. So that's
that's a good way to put it. See the math, because that is how I feel. Like it's the thing that distances you from the story, I think, right?
I haven't seen a lot of these, but I'm curious if you've seen it. I don't think you have, but there's so I think there's a lot of types of anime that's like this, where it's 3D it's stylized to look 2D. But the one that I saw like a year or so ago, I think it's a little bit older than that, where there were times where I was like, this looks like you drew it, but I know you didn't because of how crazy you're being with the camera. Was Promare. I don't know if you saw it. It's a really fun, really high energy anime film, and it goes to a lot of wild places, but it's like, it's all 3D. Yeah. But the way that they're posing the characters and like expressions and the angles that you see them, I mean, it looks just seamlessly like a 2D animation. But then they really go out of their way to hit you over the head with the fact that it's not, because of the camera movements that they're doing, and they're like, flying through all these 3D spaces. But it is kind of similar to Spider-Verse in an animation sensibility.
What's it called again?
And just for that, Promare, Promare.
Okay, I'll check it out. Have you seen Beasters? or B-Stars. I don't even know how to pronounce it.
Oh no, I haven't. I have heard of it, but no, I haven't been able to watch it. It's another
3D that's pretty nice, and they make it look 2D. And just like you're saying that, when the way the camera's moving and everything, you kind of say like, oh wow, this is 3D. But just glancing at it, clearly, if it was just playing, I don't know if I would have noticed what it was. But again, the people who are making it, I mean, I think a lot of the anime, the subject matter a lot of times is really specifically not for our, it's not for the West. It's harder to get through that. And sometimes it's even difficult for me, but I love the aesthetic of it. I love the way that it looks. And I love that they're kind of just throwing out the rule book and kind of doing that. And they get to do that because adults watch animation there, right?
Right. Everybody that grew up with it is still invested in the same way.
And even like in the UK, for instance, like Scanner Darkly made as much money in the UK than it did in America when it came out theatrically, even though the UK is like a tenth of the population of America. I don't know if I'm right about that.
Oh, interesting.
But, it really, what it said to me was like, it's really a perception problem. And I don't know, I mean, this could sound conspiratorial, but stuff like the Academy sort of making these subjective decisions about what is or isn't and being able to really control what people see stifles creativity and stifles that audience from growing beyond that. And that probably benefits those companies, right? Disney and Pixar aren't going to make those other kinds of movies. They're going to make the movies that they know people, that there's a built-in audience for. It's always about mitigating risk at the studio level. And so, again, what I want is, as people talk more about this, as it becomes a serious format of storytelling that people understand and realize it can go further, it's just going to elevate that storytelling. It's just going to elevate the craft of animation. So.
Right. And bring in, like you were saying, I think part of what appealed to me with Apollo is the painterly approach to the backgrounds and things that feel, there are art styles that are more emotionally connected to me as like a cartoonist and like illustrator. And I think that goes such a long way for people, whether you're an artist or not. Like certain looks of things can really connect with you. And just bringing in all these new influences, like you were saying, anime appearing places where you wouldn't have seen it before, that can bring in people to new stories and just do so much overlapping. It's like so cool. But like you said, the industry is like codifying an idea is like the goal, so they can keep iterating on that. But bringing new stuff in, it's like, it's tough. But that's why it's cool to talk about this stuff.
Don't do that.
That's why our punk indie podcast is here to revolutionize the animation industry.
Well,
it's true, but we still...
It does start that way, right? It always is an organic movement. It always is the spark that goes through that. I'm confident that the audience is there. The audience doesn't know that yet,
Right. Yeah.
I think that's true. And I don't want to harp on this podcast. This feels like very like PR-y in a way that I'm totally not used to talking about. But like, I do feel like that's the heart of this podcast because it's called Cartoon Feelings for a reason. It's not about, like, we have a lot of people on as guests who are not animators, or like they are writers, or just like authors. Like some people write like, graphic novels, whatever, but it's mainly from the story perspective and then an appreciation of the art and the production process that we're talking about. So like, I've always felt like, this podcast in my mind isn't necessarily for people who are just like, I also love animation in the same way that you do and I'm an animator, but like to talk about, for the longest time we started out just talking about animated movies that like really meant a lot to us as children, and like we weren't thinking about it from that perspective. It's like that happens to everybody. Everybody could probably think of like I don't watch that stuff, like whatever, but like if you're into storytelling or filmmaking or whatever, there's probably at least one animated movie that you saw that really meant something to you. And like unpacking that, I think, is the fun part. Just to make it more about like, this is a medium of storytelling and why that's so great and the strengths of it, not just, perpetuating like love of animation just for itself, which is also great.
But,
sure.
But also just thinking about it in terms of cartoons, right? Which is like, I love the term cartoon. And, and we did go backwards. A lot of people don't know that the Flintstones was a primetime series. The Flintstones came on during prime time. It wasn't a Saturday morning thing. It was like a primetime television show, kind of like The Simpsons, right? And at the height of The Simpsons, I remember being more emotionally moved by The Simpsons than any live action drama. At the core of The Simpsons, during its heyday, it was the best story about family in America at that moment. I cried watching an episode of The Simpsons before, and for me, what that sort of informed me was that you could take something that, they're crudely drawn, they're yellow, there's nothing really realistic about The Simpsons, but the emotions that I felt were completely present and real. And that really sparked something in my head. I sort of realized that the cartoon form, even though it distances you from reality, it can actually bring you closer to something that's real through that medium.
Well, I think that the voice acting, I think what you said early on was so key. It's like the thread that can hold you through like moments of abstraction or things that are unfamiliar at first, but then you recognize them. Like the voice is like so important.
Yeah.
Which is a good point, like a good overview observation.
And it's a cartoon, like the old ones, like they're pretty violent towards the kids. Like Homer would be like choking Bart and stuff like that. Like, you can't show that in live action, but that's kind of what it feels like. When we got like Apollo 10.5, my daughter's 12, right? So she was 10 when I was making that. Actually 9.5. She was exactly the age that Stan's supposed to be in Apollo 10.5. So I really much was kind of like making this movie. I thought, like, this is going to be the first movie my daughter can watch. She starts really waking life and Scanning Darkly or a little bit over her head. And when we got the ratings back, it wasn't considered like a kid's movie. And I'm like, what's in there that's like so bad? There was animated smoke from animated cigarettes that pushed the rating up and made it like not like the kids couldn't watch it. And I was like, it's cartoon, man. Like I grew up watching people blow, like Bugs Bunny would like get his head, blow off somebody's Elmer Fudd's head or something. I don't know.
Usually with a cigar, a lot of the time. Cigar bomb.
So much violence and like, dynamite exploding their heads and stuff like that. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's a cartoon. It's a cartoon. It's
it's interesting. I find like as a cartoonist, like I work in like middle grade graphic novels, it really is the way you draw something. Like I wonder if it's something about the way you represent the cigarette that's more the issue than that there is one. Because I've had panels I've had to redraw because they're too like gory.
Right.
And it's not that I can't use the idea. I just need to like change how I visualize it. Right. It's just interesting how people interpret it.
It's the underlying realism that tweaks them, right? So, I mean, if the characters didn't have realistic looks and coloring, the Academy wouldn't be having this problem. If it was a bunch of ducks walking around doing the same thing, same movie, it would have been fine, Yeah. But again, I have a problem with that. Because for this story, we wanted it to be grounded. We wanted it to be naturalistic. We wanted that. That was all intentional. I could have made them ducks, but I didn't want to. So like what is it? What's really, who's making that decision? That's a storytelling decision. That's not, anybody's, I don't think anybody should have the right to make that subjective decision about what is or isn't, animation based on whether or not it's realistic or a bunch of talking ducks.
Yeah. I mean, I'd watch your duck movie too. That sounds cool.
Well, one of the things I
didn't
talk about was I am doing a project that would be real people and animals that talk, because apparently that's what everybody wants.
Yeah, I will say I would like to watch that.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting to
me. What do you mean, like a Roger Rabbit type of thing?
They will all be animated because I don't want to go the hybrid route.
Right.
But I'll tell you, I don't want this to be out, but I'll tell you guys, it's based on a book called Gun with Occasional Music by Jonathan Lethem, who's a writer.
Oh, okay.
Gun with Occasional Music. And it's a noir story. It's a sort of detective murder mystery kind of thing.
Oh my God.
But the sci-fi element is, they've evolved animals to have human characteristics. So the antagonist is like this mean kangaroo guy who's walking around with a drink.
Oh my God. The cover is phenomenal. Yeah, there's a kangaroo with like a whiskey glass and a cigarette slouching against the frame.
Didn't you do something with Amnesia Moon?
Yeah. Jonathan's he's a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, okay, cool.
Like when I was working for Microsoft, I did that. So my dirty secret is that I'm good with technology. And my whole life was trying to like
disgusting,
not go into the technology world was always wooing me, and the film world was always shunning me, and so I was sort of like, I've really been doing that tightrope. And when times were tough making movies, I would work for tech companies and do that. So that was a period when I was working for Microsoft for that. And again, it was doing real-time animation. It was a long time ago. And it was under their research division, and it was great, but ultimately when you do stuff for that, it's all about IP and they're patenting, they're patenting techniques and stuff like that. And I was I missed having an audience, and I was like, I can't really do this because I enjoy sharing stuff that I do with people.
Yeah, I kind of breezed over that moment because I had a couple notes from that. That's like 2000, 2001.
Yeah, it was after probably 2002. They looked at Waking Life, and then when I did the Machinima music video, that was really like, wait a second, this guy's doing this out of his garage, and they were spending $9 billion a year at that time, and they were like, how's this guy kind of more cutting edge than we are in our own studio? So they just headhunted me and found me. But again, I had a lot of good advice, and people said, like, you probably won't be happy working at Microsoft, which it wasn't bad. But what happened, all their other projects got cut, and mine was the only one that was succeeding. So they just took everybody from all these other projects, put them onto my project. And I said, like, leave me alone or else I'll quit. But their job's depending on it. So they didn't leave me alone, so I quit.
Wow.
Interesting.
Wild.
It's funny how, because in a similar scenario, you see like creative, like directors get absorbed by bigger studios like Marvel or Disney, and everybody's like, oh, if they would only make their own thing, we could still have their voice, but we lose it in the machine. It's like not that different of a story. Like if you had pursued that, we wouldn't have probably had a Scanner Darkly or these other things, because you wouldn't have been there to be that asset. You would have just been like behind the scenes at Microsoft doing good work, but people wouldn't.
And all that helps.
No stories.
I mean, it helps to do different things, and it helps to be exposed and to think about things in a different way. I mean, animation is technical at its very core. Filmmaking has always been technical at its very core. It is about the technology that you're doing, and it is an illusion of light and shadows at the end of the day. And so now it's more the illusion.
Yeah, it's okay to work at a tech company, Ira.
What's that?
It's okay if some people work at a tech company.
No, I think I'm just saying, but it's hard to get your voice out there with it, right?
I agree.
I mean, I have that problem.
That's my situation.
But yeah.
For me, it comes easier to me than storytelling, right? So that's just my natural thing. And they offered way more money than the storytelling part of it does. So for me to actively not work in the tech industry was a difficult decision to do every single time, because it kind of doesn't make sense for me to, tell stories. It's like I've never had a mainstream success ever, right? So it's sort of, it's tough. And it was that choice that you have to make at some point. And of course, and again, I love it as a safety net. Every single time I needed money or whatever, I'd go work for a tech company. That's fantastic. That's really the best thing. And when I tell people who are trying to get into the film industry or animation or whatever, I always say, like, make sure there's some other way you can make a living, because it's very difficult to make a living. And that's the trick. If you can figure out a way to make a living telling stories, that's the main hurdle that you have to get over into becoming successful. Because I'm sure you guys know, if you're working another job, it is hard to find the time and the energy to work on your own stuff after that. If it's a full-time job, if it's really demanding, and if you're getting money, I bet it's demanding.
Totally.
Fuck. I quit my job. No, that's true. All of that's really true.
Yeah. Well,
weird, huh?
But I think, all of us, like, we all have that kind of techie background in some ways. Like, I studied graphic design. I can do publishing related stuff, but I want to tell my own story. You have like all kinds of motion graphic skills.
Yeah, it's like I do animation, but it is all like marketing stuff now.
But at the end of the day, like we both want to draw.
Yeah, I was like, can you just pay me the same amount you're paying me now, but I get to do whatever I want?
Yeah.
No one said yes though, but maybe someday.
Yeah. Well, that's all for now. You can check out our episode archive and other facts at cartoonfeelings.com. And you can tweet at us and join us on Instagram. Both of those are at Feeling Cartoons. With a special thanks to our producer, Josh Romeo, without which none of this would be possible.
That's true.
Kinda.
It's all on you, Josh. So don't mess it up, bro. And if you're enjoying the podcast, Josh, Romeo, or others as well, we'd be so grateful if you consider taking the time to rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and or share us with your friends. Ooh, I see that there's a new note here in this document, Ira.
Well, because now there's more content available separate of the main feed.
Oh my god, it looks like it's at www.patreon.com.
Yeah, we have some bonus episodes, right?
Something? We do! Oh my god. Yeah, we've got a Haunted Mansion episode and more to come. Ooh, spooky. I mean, so yeah. Thanks so much.